Okay, great. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Angie, you want to yell maybe one more time that we're starting? Okay. So we had two guest speakers for today, our very own Steve Porter and John Vaudreuil, who was the former Attorney General that was appointed by Barack Obama. But John just got back from Sri Lanka yesterday afternoon and is horribly sick. So he was trying to get here, but he's really, really not well. He emailed us at 9:15 this morning saying, I cannot do this. So we have all his information, and Steve has been an attorney focusing in civil rights since 1983. And so he's very well versed in a lot of this material, and he's been studying it as part of our sanctuary group. And so Steve has been a member. Everybody here knows Steve. Steve's been here since 1988. So next year he'll join the long-term members group after 30 years. So why don't we just go ahead and get started, and Steve's just going to talk, and because part of our guest speakers are not here today, we're going to have this be really informal. So if Steve says something that doesn't make sense to you and that you want to talk more about, just raise your hand and I'll bring the mic over, and let's just have a really open discussion then. Okay? Great, Steve.
Yeah. And just so you know, we're recording this, so don't say anything you don't mean. Yeah, I'm really disappointed that John Vaudreuil couldn't be here. John was the U.S. attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office as an attorney since 1980, and was most recently the U.S. attorney appointed by Barack Obama. And throughout the course of my practice, he's always been known as the good guy, the reasonable guy over in the U.S. Attorney's Office. And beautiful man. Now he's been retired by Trump, and he's spending all his time traveling around to exotic places, helping them establish their legal processes. And he had one day in between flying in from Sri Lanka and flying out for Kazakhstan or something like that, and he agreed to come speak to us. But apparently his travels have just been taking a toll on him. So I'm going to apologize because the light is so bright coming in here. All you are just shadows out there to me. So if I look like I'm sort of dazed, that I'm a deer in the headlight. John and I have been in touch back and forth for the last few days, exchanging emails. He sent me his outline, so I know what he's going to say, and it dovetails well with what I want to say. As Laura said, I'm a civil rights attorney. I litigate civil rights cases, but I also originally was a general practitioner, did a fair amount of criminal defense work, so I understand how that works. Although I didn't do a lot of federal criminal work, I feel comfortable in that area as well. And a lot of this really dovetails with basic fundamental constitutional principles. So the law is not the kind of thing like a dictionary where you just look it up and there's your answer. That's the definition. Not only is there the so-called black letter law, which is what the text of the criminal law would say, there are layers of interpretation by courts, and not only courts, but in your area, but courts in other areas that may have persuasive authority. Some courts have.
Can everybody hear?
Not very well.
Not very well.
I turned it on.
He turned it on. Let's make sure it's actually on.
Is there a volume thing on it?
I think it turned itself off.
Oh, you think it turned itself off?
Oh, it did?
Yeah, it did turn itself off.
Maybe the battery's a low?
Yeah, otherwise you could use this handheld one.
Yeah, just give me the handheld and I'll just use
Okay.
that.
Let me turn it on. Sorry about
Well, it's
that.
on. I don't know. Can people hear
It
me?
was on.
Okay, so
It's good.
it's good? Okay. Let us know if it turns off again.
So,
People can't hear.
and then there's not only the interpretation of the law by the courts, but there's the interpretation of the law by the people that have to enforce it, meaning, in this case, ICE or the U.S. Attorney's Office or federal marshals. or even the local district court.
Yeah, it just turned off again.
Okay.
We're gonna give you this one.
Okay. And then but the point is that there are multiple levels of both interpretation and discretion with regard to enforcement. So regardless of how the U.S. Attorney might want to interpret the law, he has to fit the enforcement into his priorities, because no U.S. Attorney's office can enforce everything that comes before them. That's why we have plea bargains, and that's why we have set priorities, and that's why, for example, the Obama administration was able to set the DACA policies, which were simply, they didn't change the law, they simply changed the enforcement priorities of the Department of Justice. So I'm assuming that all of you understand that this talk has to do with the exploration that this church is going through to decide whether we might want to become what's been termed a sanctuary congregation with regard to undocumented aliens in this country who may be subject to scrutiny and action, particularly under the new federal administration. And we formed a refuge group here after the elections out of concern for protecting vulnerable populations that our church serves. But that's what the context of this is. What would happen to us? What if we decided to be a sanctuary church or to provide some... Now what?
I think this mic turned off too. Is there? Do we have a mic that...
Move out from underneath.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. And then people will just hear him without a mic?
Can you hear me? I'll talk loud.
Because these mics keep shutting themselves off. I don't know.
They may be out of juice.
Both of them?
Yes.
Okay. So we're exploring in this church. Do we want to become a sanctuary congregation in some capacity? There are a number of options, all the way from providing housing for an undocumented immigrant right here in the church, maybe down in the catacombs, or providing other services and assistance to churches that are sanctuary churches, and or helping out in a number of ways. The question is, what is the legal liability for doing that? What is our risk? What are we putting our necks out for if we undertake any activity that might support an undocumented immigrant? How's that?
It has to be higher.
There you go.
There.
Okay, so the main statute that we're looking at is actually not in the criminal section of the U.S. Code, but under the immigration part of the code, and we're talking about 8 U.S. Code Section 1324, and I'm just going to itemize the areas of criminal liability as specified by the statute itself. Then I'm going to talk about the different layers of interpretation and the different layers of discretion that could come to bear, which are part of what we would factor into what is our exposure to liability. So the very first provision of 1324 targets any person that knowingly brings or attempts to bring into the United States an undocumented individual. So the context of all of this is that the rest of it, in terms of harboring and other crimes related to immigration, have to be taken in the context of the overall concern about bringing illegal undocumented immigrants into the country in the first place. The second category of crimes has to do with transporting or moving or attempting to transport or move such aliens in furtherance of such a violation of the law. What does that mean? The next category is the one that we would probably be most concerned about, which is conceals, harbors, or shields from detection, or attempts to conceal, harbor, or shield from detection such an alien. Now, what does it mean to conceal? What does it mean to harbor? What does it mean to shield from detections? The lead case in this district, in this appellate district federally, involves a situation where a woman was prosecuted and convicted at the trial court level of harboring her boyfriend, who was an illegal alien who had come into this country and been kicked out and came back in and came back to live with her and had a drug operation going. And they convicted him of the drug operation, and then they convicted her of harboring him because he was living with her. But when it got to the Court of Appeals in this district, they threw it out, and in that case, the Department of Justice attempted to use a dictionary definition of harboring, and the court just railed against them on that and said, you know, we're not talking about dictionaries. We're talking about interpreting a statute that has a definite purpose, and we have to interpret this in the context of the purpose of, was this woman actually involved in a pattern or a system of bringing illegal people into the country? And the court said there was no evidence of that. Probably the motivation for the prosecution actually had to do with the drug operation, and that the U.S. attorneys figured that she was involved in that, but they didn't have enough evidence on that, so they decided to throw this one at her. So those are the three main categories. In the ordinary garden variety violation, you're facing fines and up to 5 years in jail. But then you also have the question of who is facing, if we did this as a congregation, who would be an actual defendant. So there are many layers of questions that are involved. What John Vaudreuil was going to tell you is what the immigration enforcement priorities were and the activities that his office undertook during the 40 years that he served. And basically he confirms what the essence of the message is that I'm trying to give today, is that all of the prosecutions to date, really nationwide and throughout time, have always been have never been just because somebody was harboring an undocumented alien. The prosecutions have all been in the context of other criminal activity that the government wanted to interdict. And so what John says is that the U.S. attorney has the discretion to set district policy for criminal cases, and in the Western District of Wisconsin, which is the district we're in, the cases were almost exclusively involving re-entry after prior removal criminal cases. The prosecution categories for exercising discretion in re-entry cases were after removal for aggravated felonies. If you commit a crime, even a misdemeanor, but especially a felony, and you're an undocumented alien, you get convicted of it, you'll be deported. And so their main concern were such individuals who re-entered the United States after being deported for committing a crime. Steve?
Seems like that if we're going to give sanctuary to someone, we should do a criminal records check on them and make sure that they haven't been involved in drug dealing.
Yes, yeah, and certainly the vetting process, if we do make a decision to house somebody here and provide them sanctuary, we definitely want to vet them very carefully on their criminal background, but also on a whole number of other categories that I won't go into today, but that's part of the discussion we're undergoing.
But I wanted to say with that we as a congregation will have a say on who we allow to have sanctuary here. And there's a lot of people that are undocumented that have no criminal record that are being deported. And so what we want to target are the people that have an appeal case and have good chance of winning that appeal case. And if they have a criminal record, they're not going to necessarily win. They're not going to win their appeal. appeal. And so we want to target people that are in appeal and that have a good chance of winning their appeal.
Right, and that also brings up an important jurisdictional distinction here too that applies, which is that the agency for enforcing the immigration laws in terms of detecting undocumented aliens and deporting them is ICE. I forget what that stands for. Immigration, Customs.
Enforcement?
Yeah, and they are not a law enforcement agency. They're not an agency with the power to issue warrants or start a criminal prosecution. So, at the very first level of contact, we might have somebody who ICE is interested in, and who ICE might want more information about, and there might be contact between the church and ICE, but that is at least one step removed from the potential for a criminal prosecution of us. For any criminal prosecution of the church would have to take place according to a decision by the U.S. Attorney's Office that there was probable cause for a crime being committed and that it was within the context of their priorities that they would want to enforce this. It's important to understand that ICE itself has a policy.
Steve?
Yes.
If I could just make sure I understand. We're working with La Fontaine.
Voices La Fontaine.
Thank you. So basically, they have contacts, they're screening, and then if they identify someone who needs sanctuary that they think would be someone that might win their appeals case or whatever, then over and above that, we can rescreen. But there's some level of screening that happens even before it gets to us. Is that correct?
If we go through Voces de la Frontera, yeah. And Voces de la Frontera encourages each congregation to identify their own criteria because there are a lot of criteria that we need to think about. Do we want a person with children? Do we want a person that's married? Do we want a person that's employed and has to go outside the church every day to a job? Do we want a smoker? Do we want a drinker? Do we want a person, who wants to bring friends into the church to socialize in his room? There are all kinds of considerations. And
just to follow up then, so they would have someone who suddenly needs sanctuary. We would have a process on top of that screen that brings up all those good points and presumably there would be some time pressure, right? So if the person needs sanctuary, whatever process we set up has to be somewhat timely, yeah?
Right, and haven't even really commenced that process.
No, I understand that. I'm just trying to understand what will be involved.
Right.
If we agree to be a sanctuary church.
Yes, yeah, and there are some churches that are a little further along in that process than we are, and I think we're intending to have them come in and speak.
There's 4 that have declared themselves sanctuary.
And have we invited them to come tell us about their process?
No, I think that's December.
I think we're thinking of December. One of the possibilities for December is that we can bring people from those congregations that have already half a year ahead of us.
And sorry, while we're off topic.
Yeah.
So for the congregations that have already declared themselves sanctuary, they're putting together their volunteer lists of people that are willing to do meals, grocery shopping, stay overnight, be with the families. And so if you're willing to volunteer, I'm starting our network and I have a spreadsheet. If people can email me or Angie what they're willing to do. If people have legal skills or medical skills as well, they're looking for that. Fluent in the language, fluent in the language. If you could let me know, that'd be great.
And we've got about 10 minutes left, so I want to be sure the most important thing maybe to convey to you is that ICE itself has a policy that's in writing against enforcing the immigration laws in the context of sensitive locations. Now, this is a policy of ICE drafted by themselves. Again, it has to do with their discretionary priorities with regard to how they're going to go about picking people to target and come after. It's not the law. It's not even a regulation of the Department of Homeland Security, but it is a policy. It's a written policy. It's been in effect for some time, and probably most importantly, it was revised and pretty much readopted as it stands in February of 2017, since the new administration came on. And you can go to the website of ICE and find frequently asked questions concerning that policy. But basically, the policy is that they simply will not enforce in sensitive locations such as hospitals, schools, during public demonstrations, and places where there's a religious ceremony is taking place, such as weddings and funerals, or in churches. So it's very unlikely that even on a national level, ICE is going to want to target churches that are providing sanctuary. On a local level, I would say in Madison in particular, given the disposition and orientation of the U.S. Attorney's Office, which I was hoping John could tell you a little more about, and the federal judges here in this district, I think it's very unlikely that even if there was a technical possibility that we could be exposed to criminal prosecution, I think it's very unlikely that would happen unless there's a drastic shift in the political priorities of this administration. Steve?
It seems like someone needs to monitor that carefully and be connected with the other sanctuary congregations, see what changes there are. You need to monitor that website.
Right.
Be aware of the news.
Yeah, if Trump withdrew the policy or whatever, we would want to take note of that. But I don't think even he wants to step into in people coming into churches.
Because this then kind of also becomes a religious liberty issue as well.
It could be, and he is going after, quote, sanctuary cities, but the courts aren't upholding that either, and so I think that the bottom line takeaway is that we're pretty safe on that. Annie?
Didn't ICE though go into hospitals recently?
There was some incident, and I don't know the details of it. I remember hearing it on the news somewhere. I think it was out on the West Coast. It was in Texas.
People were bringing their child to hospital for crucial medical service.
Yeah, and you saw what the uproar was for that, and I don't think they want to step into that very often. I don't know if that was in the context of some kind of criminal issue as well. I don't know. They do. I know one of the issues that prompted enforcement that got to the Court of Appeals in Chicago that governs this district had to do with welfare fraud and things like that. If there's some of that going on, but it's very unlikely that, as has already been suggested, if we are careful in screening someone here, and we're not running some kind of criminal racket in conjunction with bringing people here, I think it's extremely unlikely that we would be prosecuted. The only time religious group part of a church was prosecuted that I'm aware of was in the 1980s when we had CISPAS. How many of you remember that? We had Nicaragua and El Salvador, and we had a lot of atrocities happening down there, and we had people trying to escape the terror and the horrible situations. This was during the Reagan administration. And there was a church in Arizona that was actually going down to Mexico, crossing the border and connecting with refugees from El Salvador and Nicaragua and bringing them across the border and intending to house them and shield them from the enforcement authorities. So if we're, and they were prosecuted, I don't even know what the outcome of that was. I don't even know if anybody would have done any jail time as a result of it. But we want to be careful in how we do things. We want to make sure that we probably want to be public about how that we're doing this, because then there's no question of concealing. and or trying to avoid detection. We don't, if ICE officials come to the front door of the church, we're not going to be having a car with the motor running in the back to put, run the person up to Canada, because that's probably pretty clearly transporting. We're not gonna bar entry to ICE unlawfully, but it's important to realize that ICE comes out with warrants that are, if they're not signed by a judge, we don't have to let them in. We don't have to let them search, and if they come without a warrant, we can assert those rights. But we're not going to commit civil disobedience by, breaking the law if illegal enforcement action takes place.
Are there any implications in terms of tax deferred status?
I'm sorry.
Are there any implications related to our tax deferred status?
Well, that's a whole other area. There is a question, if we ever did get convicted of criminal activity here, there is a possibility that we could lose our tax exempt status. I'm not a tax lawyer, and that's one area that I'm aware is on the fringe of this. I have not researched it at all. I do have an outline from, I attended an online CLE by a group of lawyers that are advising people in churches in Minnesota about the sanctuary, the legal risks of sanctuary, and it's about an 8-page outline, but it's excellent. There's 9 pages, I guess. And what I'm going to invite all of you to know is that we have a Facebook site, Refuge at CPC, but we also have a Gmail group that I think is Refuge at Gmail, right, or something.
The email either Laura or you can add that into it.
And rather than hand out all these documents to you that 99% of you are going to just dump them, if you're really motivated, we're going to put all of these online, and you can look at them. And this one in particular takes all the issues. Directly employing an individual without work authorization, that's a no-no. You're going to get a criminal prosecution for that. So if we have somebody here, we have to make sure that there's nothing that looks like we're employing them in the church. No janitorial work, no helping out around, even if it's not for pay, we've got to be very careful that it doesn't look like we're employing an undocumented individual. Providing housing, I've already indicated that housing alone the courts have said, is not harboring. That's even in a context where a guy was running a restaurant and had a house across the street where he was giving free lodging, room and board, to the undocumented people working in his restaurant. He got a criminal prosecution for that, plus a whole bunch of other things, and the Court of Appeals overturned the harboring and said providing housing alone is not harboring. So it's a housing plus standard. Well, a housing plus what? Housing plus employment is definitely going to be illegal. Is housing plus taking them to work? Is housing plus providing them meals, aiding and abetting? Is housing plus providing daycare to their children? Is that going to be illegal? I mean, we don't know. The cases there's really no cases on this. The law is totally unclear. But the likelihood on this, the nice thing about this thing that I'm going to publish, it not only tells you, whether it's illegal or not, what is the likelihood of it being enforced. In sensitive locations, the likelihood is very, very low that it would be enforced. Another issue that comes up is driving an undocumented immigrant to appointments. Is that transporting in violation of the criminal law? Probably not illegal. Generally, transporting has to be in the course of helping the person to enter the country illegally or to engage in some other criminal activity like illegal employment. Providing employment, housing, access to medical care and banking services altogether, would that be illegal? Taken individually, probably none of those things would be illegal, but the question is when you get to the point where you tip the balance. And so we have to be very careful about all that. What about marshaling resources to support individuals and families facing deportation who are being housed in sanctuary spaces? What if we just became a sanctuary supporting congregation? Are we aiding and abetting? Well, the way the aiding and abetting law works is that we would only be aiding and abetting if the congregation that we were helping was convicted or prosecuted for illegal harboring. Then if we're taking meals over there or providing child care or whatever we might be doing to assist that other church that's already sheltering somebody, we have to look carefully at whether what we're providing or doing to help is aiding and abetting. And is it really in the context of, in the way the courts look at it, is it in the context of enticing an undocumented alien to come to this country? Is it in the context of making it so that they could stay here if they otherwise were not able to stay here? And what they said in the girlfriend case was, this guy was here. He spent some of the time staying at his mom's house. He spent part of the time staying at friends' houses. He spent part of the time staying at his girlfriend's house. So providing the services by the girlfriend was not something, this guy was going to stay in the country no matter what. So, generally what I'm trying to get across to you is the courts are, unless you're really hardcore in the process of sort of being one of these guys who recruits a gang of immigrants and carries them in the back of your truck or something to go to a workplace or to a farm or something like that to work illegally, I really don't think that you're in danger and risk of being prosecuted criminally, and especially if you're a church, because the important thing about the church is that our intent and purpose is going to be express our religious values and our spiritual values. It's not for our own personal gain. It's not for illegal economic activity, which most of these cases have involved. So it's not even for political activity. It's the church in Arizona that I spoke to you about. Part of the reason they were held liable is because the court determined that they crossed the line from affirming their religious values and living their religious values to making political statements. And that's another way to lose your 501c3 status, is to engage in political activity. Now, what we're doing may fit into a political context in this country, but that's not our motivation. Our motivation is, and we must be sure that we make this very clear in any public statements, is to affirm our faith and the values of our faith.
Maybe, I don't know if you touched on this, I came in a little bit late, but about 10 years ago, I think there was a movement to establish a legal status for people that wanted to work here. Maybe not be citizens, but be here legally to work, which many people wanted to do. Is there anything that you know of at all, federally or state or in any way that's being developed to help have this status be available to people to be here legally?
There have been attempts, and the law as it currently exists has many layers of opportunities to do that. Probably the vast majority is, I'm not an immigration lawyer, and so I'm kind of talking out of school here, but to my understanding, the vast majority of undocumented immigrants in this country did not come across the border illegally. They came under some work program and the visa expired. Their green card expired. They had some limited tech visa. They have tech visas. They have longer term types of visas. They have student visas, and then they overstayed them, and so there is. And in the 1980s, under the Reagan administration, they just granted pretty much a blanket amnesty to all of those people, and then they created this law that we're talking about right now, and they said, now employers have to fill out these I-9 forms, which it's the employer's affirmative obligation to ask for the documentation for their workforce and things like that. So, and then that's when it became strictly illegal to employ unless they fit into one of these categories. So, what's happening with the sanctuary churches is that a lot of the churches are providing sanctuary to individuals who you just raised the question of. They're here, they were working, their papers expired, and they're in the immigration courts trying to get some kind of a determination that'll allow them to stay here and work. And in the meantime, rather than have ICE just sweep them right up out of the country, which ICE is doing without due process. And they're, permitted to do that. If they're here in the church, we can provide the opportunity for them to have the sanctuary they need to fight through the courts. And so in the screening process, one of the things we're going to look for is, do we have an individual like that who has a credible chance of prevailing in the immigration courts to get some kind of dispensation to stay here? If it's a hopeless case and it's a criminal, we're probably not going to shelter them. But the screening process has to be sensitive to all of those subtle determinations. Lauren?
We can take a couple more questions, but otherwise we need to wrap up for second service.
John Renee?
I just wanted to bring some clarification to the question about immigration reform or attempt to have an immigration reform here. I think about 10 years ago, there was a bipartisan effort that moved close to reach an agreement and vote into law to have a kind of huge immigration reform that would have given legal status to people who were here undocumented. And the question was, do we do it in a way that we open path to citizenship to those people, or do we do it in a way that they just have a temporary status, pay back tax and do all the background check, and that effort never went anywhere. And then there was also another effort called the DREAM Act that was also bipartisan, but still didn't go through Congress. And then I think that's why, President Obama in 2012, so frustrated by all this effort and, seeing that nothing was moving, signed the DACA law, young people who were brought here by their parents who were still undocumented, but who had a, no criminal background, have a great potential to contribute to the society here. And DACA, for 5 years, allowed all these young people to have hope to have a work permit or be temporary legal in the country until, a couple of weeks ago when, the new administration decided that, that has to go back to Congress. So they're kind of in limbo now and waiting for Congress to act, because they had until October 5th, to renew or to, so all the people who have DACA, whose temporary work permit will expire after October 5th, will fall into illegality until Congress acts. So let's pray that, that something comes.
Yeah, and I just want to point out, these are immigration questions more than legal liability questions, but Jean Rene has spearheaded just fantastic work on behalf of our church. We now have a full-time immigration lawyer in our immigration clinic who will be helping people to answer these questions. And aside from Voces de la Frontera, that might be a source. Right out of our own ministry, there might be somebody that comes up there.
We really do need to end because the second service is starting right now.
Okay, so anybody, I'm happy to stick around and talk if people have more questions. But we probably should dismiss to go to church.
Or email Angie and I if you have questions that didn't get answered in, like the tax question, where our tax status, we'll get a more defined answer for some of these if we can.
There's a handout. It's the same one as we had in July, but there's a handout providing a overview of what's happening in Madison, and also the PCUSA's statement in support of sanctuary congregations. Thank you.